Hi, I'm Stathis, your host. Before we jump in this episode, let me introduce DevRelX. DevRelX is a hub for developer marketing and DevRel professionals. Stay home while DevRelX brings you rich content to boost your DevRel game. Access developer population insights, news, job openings, and more. Discover how to empower developers and grow communities at devrelx.com. Today's episode will start with a quote from our guest.
I think number one would be get the developer's perspective. Anyone at the company is unable to give you a perspective of somebody new. We have a saying, you can only be new once, meaning somebody who is already familiar with your lingo and your vocabulary and the API is just not going to be able to provide you with accurate feedback about what it's like to be a new user.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of Under the Hood of Developer Marketing. I'm Stathis, your host. Now our podcast is driven towards helping and empowering developers and also making their lives easier. So I'm excited to welcome today a man who takes great care of this latter part. For today's episode, I'm joined by Ian Jennings, founder of Haxor Developer Experience. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Will you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
My name is Ian Jennings, and I'm the founder of Haxor Developer Experience, and we are applying concepts of user experience research to developer experience.
So do you want to walk us through your journey? What was the driving force or the role model that led you first to technology, founding Haxor?
So my dad created utilities for the internet, especially Windows 95, and I grew up seeing him sell and support software products. And as I grew up, I started getting involved in the hackathon scene, which are 24-hour coding events where developers come together to build something over a weekend. And early in that scene at those events, we started seeing companies show up like Twilio and Stripe and SendGrid, and these developer advocates showed up and they started, hanging out with these students or young adults who were getting started. And I thought that was just the coolest job. So I was a developer advocate for 6 years, and in that time, I took a really big interest in driving developer experience. And again, this stuff is new, and I became sort of the authority at the company I worked at called PubNub in what was a good developer experience and how could we make this easier for developers. So it sort of just came through interest, partially through my father, but then also through just genuine passion. And as I got deeper and deeper into that area, I noticed that there were no tools and there was almost no support or documentation. There are no books. It's just a really new area. And I thought through all my experience, I really had something to offer into that space.
Yeah, sounds like your father was also one of the pioneers in the industry, taking care of these things. And it's a good thing that inspired you all the way to create your own company. So, what would you say was a habit that you picked up in your childhood, but you still carry to work today?
That's a really good question. Probably isolating myself in my room and coding for a really long time is something I've been doing since I was really young. And it's funny to see that turn from something that's antisocial and nerdy into something that's really celebrated culturally. And if you look at something like the movie The Social Network, you see, for me, that's like a turning point where being, this kind of closet nerd person who's working all the time or building or engineering became really cool. That's definitely something that I've carried with me over the years.
Yeah, the word nerd used to have a negative connotation, but I don't see it that way. I see it as now as something very positive. Someone who's committed to what they do and well-read and driving force, if you want.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's something there with developer relations and developer experience too, because a lot of the people that are acting as developer advocates or out there and pushing for this stuff are usually more extroverted, and it's a rare role where that combines communication and it combines that kind of nerdiness too. And I think that there's some kind of special merge or Venn diagram or something of nerdy people and extroverts who combine to get into this space, right? Because they're sort of like public figures or something. Yeah, I
Yeah.
realize I'm also talking a lot about I'm covering a lot about developer relations, but I think it's really closely related to developer experience.
Well, it is, and it's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you here on the podcast. I know what it is, but in the past, in this episode, we've heard developer marketing, we heard developer relations, we have heard advocacy. So, for someone who doesn't know it, what is developer experience?
So developer experience is the experience that a developer has as they're working with your API or technical product. And it comes from user experience, which is the idea that if we observe these people working with the products and measure their experience, we'll be able to improve our products by learning where they encounter friction or problems. But since developers are such a unique audience, we have a new term so we can focus solely on their needs versus that of a user. Users are typically more consuming. They are not investing as much time or effort into the product. Developers have their own environments, they have their own tools, they're builders, and things are a lot more complex. So we're treating it as a new field that can establish its own best practice.
The way I understand it is developer experience is also very closely linked to the onboarding process for a new product. Why is the onboarding process so important in a technical product or an API?
Well, onboarding is equivalent to any traditional marketing funnel. So this is the first experience that somebody is going to be having with your API or tool, and it's important for them to have a good experience. I have a really good anecdotal example here where when I was getting started working for PubNub, before I had even applied, I was building a product myself, and I had actually tried 5 different APIs to do what PubNub did before using PubNub, but all 5 of those APIs, none of them worked on the first try. So rather than try to figure it out or contact the support of those companies, I went to the next API until I got to PubNub, which was like the 6th one. And when I put PubNub in, it just worked. And after working there for so many years, I know why it did. They use a different protocol than a lot of the other companies had been using. But that's why developer experience is important, because I was able to switch APIs quicker than I was able to solve my problems. I was able to switch APIs quicker than I was able to solve the problems by looking at those companies' documentation. And in return, PubNub got my project, but they also got me as an employee. And so for 6 years, I was there working for this company just because they had a good developer experience. And that's why it's so important. These people are making these huge decisions based on only 1 day or 2 days of working with an API or a tool. If you look at how much AWS spend is, for example, well, if I sign up for AWS and I hate it, I might not be investing my entire company's infrastructure in AWS. And that's why it becomes important to make sure that these experiences are really great.
From what you say, developer experience is also closely linked to adoption, right?
Developer experience is directly linked to adoption. Yeah, and I think going back to that question about developer relations and advocacy, those are also closely related to adoption. Developer marketing, relations, advocacy, that's all about getting those developers to that point where they're going to have their first developer experience. They work in hand to hand, and often you'll see a lot of developer experience feedback coming from developer relations, coming from developer advocacy. And the whole point, is to drive adoption.
Yeah. Well, makes total sense. You've been long involved in developer experience. What do you think has been your biggest challenge in this field?
That's a really great question. The biggest challenge is the hardest part has been demonstrating the value of optimizing developer experience. And one of the reasons for that is it's really difficult to measure. So it's really hard to show that investing, and this comes from developer advocacy too, we see the same thing. It's hard to show in numbers that investing in advocacy or developer experience is going to directly increase adoption. Now, luckily with developer experience, things are a bit more measurable, and that's where Haxor comes in. But even with the numbers, it's hard to convince companies that this is a place they should be investing. And we can see that in the market, the companies who are investing here are doing incredibly well, but it's amazing to see the companies who still don't believe that this is a place that they need help. And I think segues great into some of the trends stuff.
Makes perfect sense, and
Yeah.
we've covered a lot of times how crucial it is to have senior level sponsor for your developer program, and this also comes in this case with developer experience. Can you walk us through about how Haxor does what it does, and what you guys look to see if something offers a good developer experience?
So at Haxor, we test and measure your developer experience, and what that means is we take your onboarding process and we work with developers who record themselves while they get started. You can see a lot from when a developer gets started with your API. You can find out where they get frustrated, where they encounter bugs. You can find any typos they make. And what Haxor does is exposes ways that you can optimize your experience to improve that process. So we work with hundreds of developers who sign onto your site and they go through your typical hello world. Most companies believe their hello world will take about 15 minutes, but in testing, we find that about half of the developers can't even get started. And if they do get started, it usually takes them about an hour. So testing is a great way to see how your expectations meet reality and effectively measure how well you're doing at optimizing your developer experience. So you can go back there and measure it every month, every quarter, and see, is it getting better or is it getting worse as we make changes and fix bugs?
That's a huge difference, I think. Going from saying that you should be bringing your hello world in 15 minutes, and you have half the people not even reaching that point, and the other half taking 4 times more the time it was supposed to be taking them.
Yeah, a lot of developer companies are currently measuring the time from a developer signing up in the portal until they make their first API call. When we record what I would call the full experience, which is about 30 minutes before that and 30 minutes after that, we see that developers typically spend 15 or 20 minutes just reading the documentation before they even sign up because they want to know it's going to work. I consider that a part of the developer experience because that's also an opportunity for them to move on or choose someone else. Like, it's amazing because we've worked with public, Fortune 500 companies, and sometimes 5 out of 5 developers can't even get through the onboarding because of some bug or problem or a typo. And these are massive companies, and this is a major part of their strategy, but yet they've never seen that perspective before.
Yeah, that's a big issue, the way you say it. And the good thing in the way you do these things is that you have, developers recording themselves give you direct access to the whole process from start to finish. So from what you've seen, what is the most common things that vendors and companies could do for a better developer experience? Or if you want, what are the things that companies are doing good with regard to developer experience?
As far as commonalities go, every company has bugs. So all the documentation, all the companies have bugs, and that's just a go-to. It's usually the low-hanging fruit. They're easy to fix. Just go have some developers sign on and find out where those typos are. Another common but very difficult problem that companies have is information architecture. Every company has made its own decisions on the languages to support, on the APIs they want to prioritize, the products they want to prioritize, and organizing those in a way that makes sense for a developer getting started that aligns with the business goals is really, really tough. And we're seeing all sorts of crazy things in the market right now. Personally, I just was working with an API called OpenTalk, which was bought by Vonage, and they have a tutorial navigator builder, meaning you enter in your use case and it determines the tutorials that you should be following. And to me, that's another attempt at solving this problem, which is contrary to like a user experience where there's a few paths, with developer experience, the first person might be working with JavaScript on the web and the next person might be Java on mobile. And those people both have to have a great developer experience, but it's rare that a company is going to give them both quality experiences And there's a whole bunch of reasons I can go into why, but typically it comes down to what the company's prioritizing versus what a developer is trying to get done. So I think a couple of things I'll say is that a really common problem is information architecture. A lot of these companies don't have the information organized in a way that makes sense for the developer experience. And a really, really common problem we see is that companies or onboarding documentation will drop a developer off at what I'll call a cliff edge. For example, a download button, and they'll say, download the SDK, but then they don't offer a guide or like the first steps. And so there's a lot of just dumping these people off in these one-way streets where there's no step two. So that's a really common thing. And the next one is releasing SDKs which are unsupported. So it's an incredible amount of work to release and support and document an SDK. And as companies play these numbers games, they're trying to support, 70, 80 SDKs in all different languages, whatever. But typically it's better to have a lower number of SDKs and a higher quality of support there, and just really target those major platforms where most of your developers are going to be anyway.
In summary, if you want frictionless onboarding and experience, you should fix your architecture to make sure that everything's in place, and don't leave developers or SDKs hanging. Is that a good summary?
I would say, yeah, try to find ways and in general, try to find ways you could be helping the developer who's onboarding. So if there's a relevant article, if there's a guide that could be in that document that they're on or that page you're looking at, put it in there and link them to it. That's really what we're seeing is just, it's not that the information's not there. It's mostly that it's not being referenced.
If you had some, quick tips for someone who wants to offer a better experience, a better onboarding experience, what would you say that, okay, here are the 3 or 5 things that I suggest you should do to achieve that?
I think number one would be get the developer's perspective. Anyone at the company is unable to give you a perspective of somebody new. We have a saying, you can only be new once, meaning somebody who is already familiar with your lingo and your vocabulary and the API is just not going to be able to provide you with accurate feedback about what it's like to be a new user. Number two would be consistent. So try to find places where vocabulary changes in between your marketing pages and your documentation. The marketing page might reference a variable as X, while the documentation might be written by an engineer, and that says the variable is called Y. So find those little inconsistencies created by your different teams. Next, I would say is segment the audience by language and by platform. So try to get developers into a place where they're working with the language that they're working with, and they don't see anything else. So if I'm working with web, I don't want to see anything iOS or Android. I don't care about that. And that's just cruft. I think a lot of companies struggle with this. So you see a lot of dev portals where this stuff is just all over the place. Number 4 would be take a look at that information architecture. So in the same way as you're segmenting, look at the organization and make sure there's a clear path from 0 to 1. Typically, we see tutorials being hidden as sort of an afterthought when often they're the number one way people get started. Make sure there's a place to go after you click download, stuff like that. And then finally, I would say just identify those bugs and typos because those things can be really frustrating. If you can go through and just test the developer experience with a few developers and have them report when things are inconsistent or wrong, I'm finding bugs in almost all the documentation that we test, we find typos. So there you go. There's 5.
I love how you connect, number 1 and number 2. It's for someone, who comes across this product and it's something completely new to them. They need to first, understand what it does. So as you said, you have your own lingo and you might be using it, but it's very hard for someone who is new to all this to connect the dots if, the dots are different or it's the same dot with 2 different names. So yeah, I can see there how this could make a huge difference.
That's a really, really good point. Overall, I think what we're dealing with is a problem where there's simply too much information a lot of times. I think that these developer experience teams are drowning under all the documentation and information that they're in charge of. and often these are small teams, so it's really difficult for them to organize and deal with this information and curate it in a way that makes sense for each experience. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing is, and a general rule for usability is, simplicity, right? We want to reduce the amount of information that a developer can see that's irrelevant. So try to get them toward the most relevant information as quick as possible, and also remove the other stuff that's irrelevant. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's a really overarching theme, which is I don't think we've seen a landscape where there was so much information and so much possibility, and that's why I think I think developer experience is just going to be a massive field. It's unlike anything else where there's so much. Every customer is essentially building their own experience. It's actually we rarely have these environments where there's so much information. Usually we're desperate to produce information and try to fill in the blanks. But here it's like, don't show me the iOS, don't show me the Android, don't show me the web. I'm trying to do something for Apple Watch,
It's an effort to, as you say, to cover all the blanks, but you end up creating more noise than being helpful. I mean, I think from bringing in all that might seem relevant to that.
Yeah, I've seen, and I'm just full of anecdotes, but I've seen some tests where the Node.js documentation was a landing page, and so even if you tell a developer, hey, can you try this Java SDK, they get stuck. They're going to see that on the homepage is JavaScript. They're going to go and try JavaScript because they think that's the recommended language, but it wasn't. It just happened to be the one that was the first one. So like there's all these kinds of things where the way you organize your information architecture is actually recommending to the developer how they should work too. It's kind of saying like, these are our priorities. And so you want to have your priorities aligned with what the developer's priorities are.
Yeah, that should definitely be the number one priority, hands down.
Yeah.
What do you love most about the work you're doing?
That's a good question too. What I like the most about it is, at the end of the day, we're improving accessibility. So by making this stuff easier, it's allowing developers who are the modern day creators, or one of the largest segment of creators right now, build their own passions and achieve their goals. For everybody who gets started with an API, for some people, that also might be the first time they work with that language. So if I'm getting started with, Twilio and Java, I might have just started working with Java that day. These companies are a part of this learning experience now. And it's essentially, it's educational content. And so I think that for me, there's a lot of satisfaction coming out knowing that we're saving people time, and that these developers are helping build their own passion. And we're helping them achieve their own goals together, right? It's like me and these companies, and we're all helping these builders work on these dreams they have, and to me, that's super cool. And the mission of Haxor is to increase accessibility and reduce the time spent on these duplicate tasks that maybe every developer who's onboarding is getting stuck on. We're trying to help innovation happen faster, essentially.
Improving accessibility, I think it's a noble cause by default. So even if in this case that you are helping guys, as you said, you're helping builders utilize, the dreams they have, the ideas they have that might be a thing that could change the future as we know it. And speaking of future, where do you see, or how do you see developer experience growing into? What do you see in the future?
I think in the future, we're going to see a lot more standardization. Right now, there's a lot of experimentation into what makes a good developer portal. How should we organize our documentation? How do we segment developers? Like I mentioned, how do we measure this stuff? There's just so much unknown right now. And I think over the next 5 years, we'll see a lot more standardization. And I think one big opportunity for that is a standardization of documentation architecture. So I think that there's an answer to how to structure documentation. It's something that I'm definitely researching. But for other things like measurement, I mean, that gets a little case by case basis. I think that we'll see a lot more resources, and I think we'll see a lot more just investment in this space. If you look at the way APIs went, I mean, APIs were very small, and there wasn't any standards or practice for a long time. For like 10 or 15 years, APIs were just, they're being monetized, but there wasn't really any. We didn't have like README IO and all these other like sort of developer tools and platforms that popped up. But now we do, right? We have Swagger or OpenAPI and these kind of specs coming out that standardize how things should be done, and those are very helpful for creating for reducing the barriers to communication and creating standards. I think for developer experience, we're going to start seeing certain documentation features become standard, or certain organizational trends become standard, and I think that's great because that'll make things easier to use.
If there are any developers listening to this, the future cannot come soon enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a utopic experience that you discussed there, but yeah, I think this is where we're going to and where we should go. In our last episode, we introduced a new section in these podcast episodes we called Let's Talk Data. What we do is we visit DevRelX, our DevRel portal, where we feature free resources. You, Ian, pick a graph that stands out to you from our trends page. Then we'll talk about why it stands out to you. We'll add the link to the episode description for our listeners. Have you picked your graph from devrelx.com/trends?
I've actually picked two. Yeah. I really like this report. It's as I'm mentioning too from the last question, it's hard to find this information, and the agencies and companies and that can produce this sort of these sort of metrics and stuff are going to be incredibly helpful to making this stuff easier to navigate, basically. Yeah.
I just want to say that this is all these results come from our developer economics survey, which is a survey for developers, and we get around 40,000 answers per year from developers from 165 countries. So what we showcase here, and it's the stuff that we want to share with the world, because our motto is we want to help the world understand developers and developers understand the world.
Yeah.
That you can use this data to get to know developers, what they want, and address that. So this is why we created the trends page here, which is free for everyone to access. But we also, want to see how people interpret this data. So yeah, which one did you pick out? And once you said plural, so yeah, that's good.
Sure. So the first one I picked is the developer program benchmark. Google, Mozilla, and Microsoft lead the pack. And this is a XY graph. On the bottom, it says developer satisfaction, and it goes from -20 to 25, a weighted score of program features out of 100. And on the y-axis, it says engagement, the percent of program users that use resources at least weekly. So on the Y, we have engagement. On the X, we have satisfaction. And on the top right, which is the most engagement with the highest satisfaction, is Mozilla, Google, and Microsoft. When I look at this chart, I think, those are massive companies that have huge budgets to spend on this. So it's great that they're allocating some of that money toward developer satisfaction. There are also companies where developer experience, developer relations, and developer tools and APIs, it's a massive part of their strategy. You can see that with Microsoft, Mozilla, and Google, of course. I think the one thing that struck out to me about this graph overall is it's not surprising to me that those companies are up there, but the rest of the companies here, and to the far left, which means unsatisfied, we have Twitter and Tencent, SAP, Alibaba, and Samsung, IBM, AMD. I mean, there's just every other, Fortune 500 company you've heard that does developer stuff. They're over there on the left. And overall, the range of this chart goes from, even though it's surveyed out of 100 to 100, it goes from -20 to 25. So in general, what it's telling me is the engagement's really high, because the engagement's about 65%. But when we look at satisfaction, everybody's leaning from like a rating of -20 to 5, which is in general telling me that developers are just unsatisfied. And even if you're Google or Mozilla and you have 70% engagement, you're only going to get a satisfaction rating of 20. That's just like, I think that like that shows you what we're talking about here. It's a small range, and I think there's a lot of opportunity on to get better at this, because a majority of these companies are just have negative satisfaction rating.
Yeah,
does that make sense? Did I interpret that right?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. The data is there to show exactly what you said, and I think it's an also indicator of how critical the developer audience is.
I found another chart. It's called How Developer Marketing Experts Segment Their Audience. And I really like that because it shows where marketing experts are targeting their budgets. The top #1 rated segment is the industry, vertical, or app category. I think that makes sense, right? Because if you're a payment processing API, you want to find developers who are doing payment processing. That makes sense. But then, strange, we get geography as #2 segment. And as we go down, we get professional versus hobbyist, and then type of development, target audience. So if we look at those three, geography, hobbyist or students, and type of development, these show the marketing priorities, right? I think it's strange that geography is there, because either that's so general that it's just a given, or we're seeing people only target developers in San Francisco. I don't know exactly what that comes down to, but developers are everywhere. The world is global, and when I work as a developer, I might use a SDK that's written in Chinese because it was produced by Alibaba. And it's true. I mean, I have used these SDKs, and it's like the SDKs in Chinese, right? So like geography, I think is strange, because I don't think it's actually geography. I think it's language, or maybe it's spend or something. That one's a little, I feel, outdated. And then professional versus hobbyist or students is interesting as well, because if we look at the strategies of like Twilio, they were investing in students for years. It seems short term to me to look at only professionals. I don't think marketing experts are looking to target hobbyists or students often, because they're looking for people who are spending money. So I think that that's a disconnect. I think that students and hobbyists are a great place to invest, because those students in 4 years will leave university and they'll become employees of a tech company where they're in charge of making some decisions. So the payout might not be immediate like it would be with a professional, but there are companies who this is a valid strategy. Company size, again, I mean, these I think a lot of these ratings are representing short-term outlook. Because if we're looking to, if I were to look at what the maximum would be for each of these ratings, it would be a large company that was full of professionals doing exactly my kind of development in my own geography. Those companies are also going to be hard to sell to, because they're probably already invested in some other platform. This chart might as well say that developer and marketing experts are targeting enterprise companies. But there's a lot of opportunity on these other ends, because people make technology decisions long before they become enterprise companies. And enterprise companies definitely are obviously huge deals, but as we know, developer marketing is a grassroots effort. And what this tells me is that what most people are doing is a top-down effort. And that's what I would say about this.
Yeah. That's totally agree there. Everything you said, and thank you for this thorough analysis. Ian, it's been great talking to you. For our listeners that might want to learn more from you, where can they reach you?
So you can find Haxor at haxor.sh, like a shell script. And you can find more about me at jmmngs.com. My name is Ian Jennings, and it's been great to be on this show. I'm just always excited to talk about developer experience, and get to know these other agencies in the space.
And it's been great having you, Ian. For our listeners, thank you for listening to Under the Hood of Developer Marketing, the podcast devoted to developer marketing and relations. If you want more episodes and resources, including industry news, or if you're looking for a new job, make sure to visit devralex.com and subscribe to our bi-weekly digest or follow us on Twitter at /datahq. Thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you.